This is a quick survey of some historical Jesus scholarship. Now, what we mean in scholarship when we talk about historical Jesus scholarship isn't just looking at Jesus in history, which was done long before people started talking about the modern era of historical Jesus scholarship. But what's meant today by it usually is the critical period from the Enlightenment till today in terms of looking at Jesus, in terms of historical information about him. Now, there have been hundreds and hundreds of works on this subject. So this is just a survey of some key samples. Because there's so many, different scholars are going to decide subjectively which samples to emphasize, but I'm going to try to emphasize a number of them. Usually, scholars divide the history of people discussing historical Jesus scholarship into three quests. Now, this is somewhat arbitrary, and it's kind of Bultmann-centric because actually, between the first quest and the second quest, and the second quest and the third quest, people didn't stop asking questions about historical Jesus or publishing about the subject. Colin Brown has documented this particularly well. Others have also done this before him, but Brown has documented it particularly well in his couple-volume work on historical Jesus scholarship. But the idea of three quests, it offers a convenient handle for New Testament professors to try to summarize it fairly quickly. And so I'm going to actually use that convenient handle today, although, again, it should be emphasized that when people were talking about no quest, there were people doing it. Joachim Jeremias, T.W. Manson, and others looking at Jesus' sayings. A lot of people were doing really cutting-edge work in that time. Well, the three quests summary, the first quest especially looks at 19th century and somewhat before that, so-called liberal lives of Jesus, what liberal meant back then. And this was the era, especially of Romanticism. People romanticized a lot about Jesus, not meaning love life type romanticism, but very idealized portraits of Jesus. And Albert Schweitzer kind of ended that era with his book, which in English is called The Quest for the Historical Jesus, complaining that everybody just made a Jesus who looks in their own image. And Rudolf Bultmann, when he came along, said, who actually cares about the historical Jesus? We've got the Christ of faith. That's good enough. And then proceeded to try to actually undermine a lot of confidence in what we can know about Jesus historically. Second quest, actually, again, this is Bultmann-centric in terms of how we define the quests, but Rudolf Bultmann was a major figure in 20th century New Testament scholarship. So when his students came along, some of them said, actually, we think there can be something known about Jesus historically, more than what our mentor thought. But still they were emphasizing, like Bultmann, the dissimilarity of Jesus from Judaism. That's where we can be sure it was appropriate for Jesus because he's so different from everything else in Judaism and everything else that his followers thought that must be just Jesus himself. This criterion has, I won't go into all the details about form criticism, that's another subject, but just to say that that particular criterion is the one that today is regarded as most problematic because the third quest especially emphasized Jesus in his Jewish context. So not a Jesus who's completely separated from his Jewish context, which wouldn't make sense in his context, and also not a Jesus who makes no sense of the movement that came from his followers. I mean, why would his followers not agree with him on anything? So that one has come in for some critique. But it is worth noting that in the history of modern scholarship, as Albert Schweitzer noted, we can't trust what came before because they just made a Jesus in their own image. A nice guy who talked about God's reign being about nice people who say that God is everybody's father and we should love our neighbor. Well, we should love our neighbor, and Jesus did say that. But again, the emphasis just on that kind of thing was more 19th century liberal lives of Jesus and was ignoring some other features of Jesus that Schweitzer came to emphasize. John Dominic Crossan, likewise, in more recent decades, well, more recent than Schweitzer anyway, again said, everybody comes up with a Jesus that's different. Historical Jesus scholarship can't seem to agree on anything. And then he proposes his own reconstruction of Jesus, with which most scholars disagreed. In the early modern period, and I take some of this from Schweitzer, who summarized what came before him, although he did it in a very self-serving way, in that he was thinking in terms of the evolution of religion. The ultimate view of the historical Jesus was his own, but who doesn't think theirs is the best, otherwise they wouldn't say it. So anyway, the early modern period, with the Renaissance, there was a big return to the sources. People still said, we love Jesus, but let's go back to the sources. So especially in this case, the Gospels. But 16th century deists had different presuppositions. And from that context comes Reimarus, who actually wrote a polemic against Christian views of Jesus. And most of what he said is demonstrably wrong in light of more current research. But at least he emphasized the Jewish context of Jesus. Now, his polemic was published after his death, because in that setting, he'd still get in a lot of trouble with dominant views. Then there were other people who came up with views of the historical Jesus, especially in the context of a rising Enlightenment anti-supernaturalism. Now, not all Enlightenment figures were anti-supernaturalistic. Some of them, in fact, in the early Enlightenment, very much affirmed the supernatural. John Locke believed in the miracles of Jesus. Some of the early deists even believed in some of those miracles. And Isaac Newton, who's often cited, actually very much believed that Jesus did miracles. But anyway, because there was a reaction against supernaturalism, well, some people said Jesus and the Essenes, they accommodated superstition to teach a higher truth, and so they offered medical and psychosomatic cures. Venturini actually went so far as to say that Jesus carried around his medicine chest. They both conveniently overestimated ancient medicine. Modern medicine is way beyond ancient medicine, but in terms of ancient medicine, sometimes they knew some things empirically, but there are a lot of things like drawing blood to make people feel better. We know a bit better than that today for sure. Anyway, David Friedrich Strauss came along, and he realized that some of the stuff that was naturalistic before him just didn't cut it. So, for example, there were people who said, how did Jesus walk on water? He knew where all the rocks were. Well, considering the depth of the Lake of Galilee, especially out in the middle where they were rowing, that really doesn't work. And so he came up with a solution that is at least more credible, more plausible dealing with narratives. And that is, he said, the gospel narratives are myth, especially when they talk about miracles. And the legend, it's legends that arose over a long period of time. Now, here's a problem with that. To say that they were legends that arose over generations of time, he had to date the Gospels much later than scholars now would. There are a few scholars that date a couple of the Gospels as late as the early second century, but I mean, nobody dates the Gospels as a whole as late as Strauss did, and most of us date all the canonical Gospels within the first century. So some have retained his conclusion, though, minus the premise. They say, well, these things arose over time through legendary accretion. He accepted exorcisms, he accepted psychosomatic healings. He didn't accept the healing of anything that would require something more than psychosomatic, which is really interesting because Strauss actually had a friend who met with a German Lutheran pastor who was known for his ministry of healing and exorcism, and actually was able to go hiking in the mountains after that, even though before that he'd been barely able to walk. Strauss explained that as psychosomatic, even though it was a diagnosed spinal problem. Be that as it may, that was Strauss's approach. Another figure was Adolf von Harnack, who did a lot with regard to the book of Acts, minus the miracles. He thought it was pretty historical. So 3/4 of the book. Also, Harnack was very influential in the study of early church history, but Harnack inherited the anti-supernaturalism of David Hume, so no miracles. He also inherited the idea of Hegel that the Geist, the spirit in history, was moving the Western world to the epitome of civilization, social Darwinism, not talking about the biological sense of Darwinism, but the idea of the evolution of culture. And he believed Western culture was the best, and he believed that German civilization was the epitome of that. Well, he, and this isn't all from him, but he kind of epitomizes this view as a very popular historian of his day. Reduce the essential gospel to ethics. The kingdom of God is a matter of the individual's heart. Resurrection is a mere symbol for the triumph of life, which is really quite different from the apostolic proclamation. He realized that the apostles were children of their day, and so was Harnack. So are we all, in a sense, but in any case, Harnack's view was really quite different, again, from what the apostles were proclaiming. Even some say a different faith, but in any case, he had a very individualistic idea of God's kingdom, very ethical idea, and this was representative of a lot of people in his day who had an enculturated, de-Judaized Christianity. Now, of course, in practice, after we do our historical study, those of us who are Christians, we also want to contextualize to show how it speaks relevantly to the issues of our day. But the problem is that if you don't have the right connection with the right Jesus of history, you may contextualize things wrongly in what missiologists call syncretism instead of contextualization. What that means is you turn it into what just appeals to your culture. His optimistic liberal Christianity died in the battlefields of World War I. This is before Karl Barth with his neo-orthodoxy, trying to bring people back to the central message of the gospel. And anyway, that's a whole other subject. But a generation later, you have the Arian Christianity of the Reich Church. These were German Christians, or the German church, not the whole church. There were the confessing Christians who pulled out, but the Arian Christians who said Jesus was an Arian. He wasn't Jewish, and they played down all Jewish elements for Jesus. And an individual piety was more malleable to Nazi strategy. What Hitler planned to do in 1945 was to eliminate all the denominations, bring everybody together under Arian Christianity. And a lot of Hitler's aides actually were not even, they didn't find Christianity that suitable. They were more into the Norse Aryan gods anyway, I'm digressing again. So back to all this. They didn't see an apocalyptic Jewish Jesus as being very useful because nobody believed, well, almost nobody in their context, academic context, believed in anything apocalyptic, or the Jewish stuff was all being suppressed. So they over-contextualized. But there were already people who had reacted against that well before this time. So Johannes Weiss emphasized the Jewish Jesus. That's something that Reimarus got right um, back in the 1700s. But Weiss also got it right by saying, okay, Jesus is Jewish. He reconstructed Judaism based on the what we call the pseudepigrapha, which is just a collection of Jewish writings, mostly Jewish writings. Some of them are actually Christian or Christian edited Jewish works. But he spoke of a Jesus who was a pure apocalyptic figure. If you want the details, it's like Second Baruch, Fourth Ezra, probably written around the end of the 1st century or early 2nd century. And First Enoch, that is pre-Christian, at least all of it except chapters 37 to 71, which are debated, but perhaps even that. Well, Schweitzer agreed with Weiss, and he wrote a book. In English, we call it The Quest for the Historical Jesus, but in German, the title was From Reimarus to Wrede. And he talked about this very, very German-centric work because not a whole lot of British scholars were in the book, not a whole lot of US scholars were in the book, certainly not a lot of African, Latin American, or Asian scholars were in the book. But anyway, this was the time in which he was writing, and he read German better, and so makes sense. Anyway, he ended much of the Jesus market of his era, pointing out that the scholars before him formed a Jesus just like them and used the Jesus that they made up, in a sense, to propagate their own views. And Schweitzer was a great marketer himself. He presented his own view as the natural evolutionary epitome or where everything was going of his predecessors. But a new consensus lasts only so long. He drew on Johannes Weiss, and he argued based on this, Jesus predicted the end of the age. We know the age didn't end. Jesus' prediction failed. Now, his weakness was, or one of his weaknesses was, he ignored present elements of the kingdom in Jesus' teaching, and also focusing so much on the pseudepigrapha, we now have other sources like the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are clearly pre-Christian, and then you also have Josephus, Philo, although that's outside of Judea, and you also have the rabbis, although that material is later, but you also have the wisdom stream that feeds into that with works like Sirach and so on. So his reconstruction of Judaism was incomplete, and his reconstruction of Jesus' teaching was also incomplete. The strength was that he recognized the genuine Jewish context of Jesus' teaching and the eschatological, the end time character of Jesus' message. That is, Jesus is talking about the imminent end of the age, or at least some sort of crisis that, like scholars debate whether that's just what happened in 70 or whether that's more in the future. Well, if Jesus waited on God and God didn't act like Jesus expected, Schweitzer's Jesus, he thought, was a good man, but he was wrong about the imminent end, and he died a deluded apocalyptist fanatic. Schweitzer puts it much more nicely than that, says, we have this stream of loving our neighbor that goes back to Jesus. Well, again, the kind of emphasis from his day, but he separates it from the historical Jesus by saying Jesus was more apocalyptic than that. But remember, Jesus also talked about a hidden kingdom, like a mustard seed, that eventually would become this mighty kingdom, but was already at work in his day. He also emphasized the value of martyrdom. He knew that prophets before him had been martyred. That was a big tradition in the Judaism of his day. And he knew John the Baptist had been martyred. And then he goes and overturns tables in the temple and publicly challenges the chief priests. I mean, Jesus didn't just foreknow his death, he provoked it. So now many people have followed Schweitzer on this. So I'm inserting my own response to that, why I think that's wrong. By dying, Jesus accomplished exactly what he intended, what he also talked about at the Last Supper and enacted and established a ritual for his disciples at the Last Supper. But that's all another story. Brent Petrie is really good on the Last Supper, but I'm moving on. So the rejection of eschatology. Schweitzer talked about that being fitting Jesus, but many in Schweitzer's generation felt little need for eschatology. Now, after 2 world wars, and since then rampant genocides and so on, they've reinvigorated the need for hope. Oppressed people naturally often resonate with the hopes of a better world more than content people do. And so there are a lot of people all around the world who still have a future hope that some academics who were out of touch with those things thought was completely dead. Some Latin American scholars and a number of other scholars have emphasized this point starkly. Well, after Schweitzer established Jesus as apocalyptic, yet deemed apocalyptic irrelevant to his day, and Schweitzer ended up having a second career as a medical missionary in Africa where he did a lot of good. But once apocalyptic was deemed irrelevant, at least to Western academia, people said, how do we translate this apocalyptic into relevant language for today? And Bultmann thought to do that. Well, the Arian Christians had sought relevance in an Aryan Jesus who was like the Norse gods and Norse heroes going bravely to their fate and so on. But Bultmann chose a different approach. Bultmann tried to make Jesus relevant to what was going on where he taught at the University of Marburg. His colleague Martin Heidegger was a great existentialist philosopher. And so Bultmann said, apocalyptic is about God coming to us as demander. And so it's not talking about something in the future. It's talking about God coming to us existentially, particularly with the existentialism of Heidegger, his colleague at Marburg. Now, in this view, history became irrelevant. And Bultmann, I think, saw himself as doing an apologetic by dismissing the value of history. Other people do apologetic by defending the reality of history. But Bultmann said, no, this way we can welcome skeptics. Sometimes people define things. I mean, I like a broad tent for a lot of purposes, especially for being able to dialogue with each other. But sometimes people make a tent that's, I think, too broad, like the idea where atheists couldn't even be atheists if they wanted to be, so long as you define theism as belief in the ground of all being. If people want to be atheists, you can't stop them. Anyway, so he said we can welcome skeptics this way. He believed that realized eschatology in the New Testament, that is, the idea of Jesus talking about the presence of the kingdom or things like that, welcoming the kingdom like a child, so on, showed that this transformation had already taken place there, and he emphasized the Gospel of John and so forth. The problem is, in the New Testament, you have both realized and future eschatology together. For example, in the Gospel of John, although he says, well, the future elements must have been added to it later. That's sometimes, I think, trying to make the evidence fit your theory. Philippians has them both together. You have in a number of places together in Paul, who was actually, most scholars believe, the earliest New Testament author. But recontextualizing Jesus, adapting him to various settings, we just need to be careful not to read that back into our sources, the Gospels, thinking that our adaptation is the real Jesus. If it's a Jesus that can't relate to all cultures, it's not the Jesus of the Gospels. It's easier to hear the biblical Jesus in most cultures than to hear Bultmann's Jesus, who's speaking as an existentialist. It may be depending on how you define your terms. But anyway, when some interpreters today play down the Jewish Jesus in favor of a Greek background, and I love Greek background, I use it in the Gospels, for the Gospels is Greco-Roman biographic form. I use it in studying Paul. I use it in my work on Acts and so forth. But playing down the Jewish Jesus who lived in Galilee and spent time in Judea in favor of a wider Greek background that's more amenable to a Western audience, when certain groups do that today, how far have we come beyond either Bultmann or his pre-Schweitzer predecessors? We can't have just a Jesus that appeals to our culture. We have to have the real Jesus that speaks to us from the Gospels and challenges our culture. Okay. That's my 2 cents. Actually, in today's culture, probably it's up to 25 cents. Inflation. After Bultmann's historical skepticism of the second quest, the second quest is defined from a Bultmannian paradigm. We had Ernst Käsemann, who announced a new quest for the historical Jesus. Gunther Bornkamm, who, like Käsemann, was a disciple of Bultmann, also wrote a work about Jesus historically. Now, there are a bunch of different views from this period. One of them actually does reconstruct a historical Jesus that's Jewish, but it's probably the wrong side of Judaism. He sees Jesus as a zealot, or maybe in today's terms, we would say a Jewish revolutionary. Zealots were a particular group within that. But Josephus reports various figures with armed followers who seem to be prophets of some sort, and figures different from them who just expected a sign of divine deliverance. Rome intervened militarily in those cases. Jesus, like John the Baptist, is viewed as more harmless by Josephus, a Jewish historian writing in the 1st century. Josephus doesn't associate them with political resistance. Not that Jesus didn't challenge the religio-political leaders of his day, but that Jesus wasn't trying to make a movement that would overthrow the establishment. Render to Caesar what is Caesar's. Depend on God rather than resist. He teaches radical non-retaliation. Now, some of it may be hyperbolic, but still, it's not the kind of thing a militant revolutionary would say. Richard Horsley, I think, captures a political Jesus much better than Brandon did. But anyway, rejoice when persecuted, accommodate oppressors for the sake of peace, trusting in divine reward and vindication. So striking you on the right cheek, turn to in the left cheek also. I have been beaten before. We're talking about Jesus, and I don't just mean figuratively. That can happen again with all the different views, but literally I've had it happen. I did not actually literally turn the cheek, but I didn't need to. My aggressor found the other cheek right by himself. Anyway, but this wasn't just a political strategy for Jesus. He's got other teachings about radical dependence on God, as Vermish points out. Jesus actually models non-resistance. He doesn't allow his followers to fight for him. He depends on his Father to vindicate him. And in the wake of the revolt that followed, given what happened at that revolt, and actually I took these pictures because they were free, because I took them with my own camera back when actually one of them somebody else took for me, because one of the pictures is me when I was a kid, and the other picture was my kid brother. So I got those free. So I don't have to pay, and nobody can sue me. The Jesus Seminar, the Cynic Jesus, and so on. Some see them as still more like the second quest, even though chronologically they're kind of into the third quest period. But they don't emphasize the Jewish context of Jesus as much as the major writings of the third quest. So if I'm going to talk about them much, I'll talk a little bit about that here, but really that should be a separate video. Now, some, like Burton Mack, whom I would consider more extreme than the center of the Jesus Seminar. But anyway, some treat the Jewish elements as later additions to the Gospels. Well, not to the Gospels, but to the earliest story about Jesus that goes into the Gospels. Now, Greek culture did affect Judea and Galilee by this period, but Jewish practice and thought did not affect Greeks too much. I mean, there were people in Rome and so on that did, adopt some Jewish customs, but really they didn't affect Greek thought that much in general. So here's the thing. The strictly Judean and Galilean features go back to the earliest memories of Jesus. There's no Gentile movement in antiquity. Gentiles are non-Jews. No Gentile movement in antiquity that adopted a conservative Jewish trajectory. There's no reason to think that the Jewish elements were added later by the later church, maybe in some Jewish streams of the church, but not by the mostly Gentile church. Some of the parallels he cites, anyway, I just try to plow through this quickly. He says, okay, people kissed each other in mystery cults. So that probably goes back to the mystery cults. That was actually pervasive in ancient culture. People kissed their friends and their relatives. Kissed relatives often light kiss on the lips. Mystery, of course, I do that with my wife, but nobody else. But anyway, says, the baptisms, they had that in the mystery religions. Well, you have a lot of initial purification rituals to enter various temples in the ancient world. And actually, in terms of Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls, you have initial washings and subsequent washings, lots of them, and so on throughout. I mean, even in the diaspora, even in the Greek and Roman world more broadly, the mysteries were not the major form of washings. Yeah, they had them, but so did a lot of other groups. And Judaism certainly had them. And John the Baptist had them. That's why we call him John the Baptist. And Josephus, again, a first century Jewish historian, mentions this. So why go for stuff way off when we know it was already being practiced in Judea? The Lord's Supper, he treats as, well, and he and some others treat it as a Hellenistic, a Greek cult meal. But would they have done that and then said, oh, okay, let's turn it into a Passover Seder later on, like in the Gospels? 1 Corinthians chapter 5, like maybe 23 years or so after Jesus was executed by the Romans. And for those of us who are Christians, we say 23 years or so after he rose from the dead. Well, Paul says Christ, our Lord, Christ was sacrificed as a Passover for us. He also, again, gives 1 Corinthians chapter 11 something that fits pretty well with a Passover background. So anyway, why would Gentiles have invented this and then added Jewish material to it? And why would later Gentiles, okay, this is the extreme, why would they have invented Jesus calling himself Messiah? I mean, that was a completely Jewish category. Some Greeks apparently thought that Christ was Jesus's last name, not, that doesn't fit. Christos, anointed one, they didn't really have a category for that. That was a Jewish idea, Mashiach, the anointed one. Anyway, the earliest extant witness about Jesus, Schweitzer was right, apocalyptic. So Paul in 1 Thessalonians, the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout. And 1 Thessalonians was written by the usual critical dating, like 2 decades before our first gospel. This is our earliest Christian witness. And if you deny the eschatological, the future dramatic teachings of Jesus, you have to dismiss evidence that we do have and make an argument from the silence that remains. I know there are some other arguments, and I'm because I'm trying to be quick, I'm not trying to deal with all of them. But again, I could deal with that in another time. I do that in my historical Jesus class. But I do that for 40 hours. And this, I'm trying to do it in under 1 hour, if possible. Jesus is a Jewish cynic. Some people have argued that. This is associated not just with Mack, but with John Dominic Crossan. Crossan, to his credit, actually doesn't stress the cynic aspect as much as some others do, even though he has a big section in the introductory background of his original historical Jesus book, and it's in the title. Well, actually, it's not in the title, but it's in some of the other stuff about it for Jesus being a Jewish cynic. But we don't know of any Jewish cynics in antiquity, which makes this kind of really problematic. We know of Jewish sages, Jewish signs workers who didn't usually succeed in their signs, but they tried, and Jewish prophets of coming judgment and so on. We don't know of any Jewish cynics. What's the comparative value of a category that has no other members in it? Also, cynics were an urban phenomenon. They don't fit too well with peasants. We don't know of any cynic peasants. So calling Jesus a Jewish cynic peasant, what are you comparing him to? There aren't any others. Anyway, and the one of the arguments was, well, Jesus grew up just 4 miles away from Sepphoris, which had some Hellenistic culture. Well, it did, especially in the later period, and it had some of it in this period, but no pig bones before the year 70. You had mikvaot, Jewish ritual immersion pools, and other features that show Sepphoris, even Sepphoris, was still fairly Orthodox Jewish in this period. And certainly some of the outlying villages were. Nazareth, where Jesus grew up, was deemed Orthodox by later priests who settled there. Real cynics lived in the street. They excreted and stimulated themselves sexually publicly. Sometimes they accosted passersby with insults, not just like, woe to you, and so on, but like they could even bop them on the head with their staff. Usually they didn't do quite that. But they had bold speech, yes, like Jesus. But so did the Israelite prophets, or at least the true ones, the ones who come out true in later texts. Jesus, when he speaks about God's reign, he's not merely critiquing the social order, he's announcing a new era that God has brought about. Cynics spoke of a philosopher fit to reign. So did Stoics. So did followers of Plato. So did lots of ancient philosophers. But Jesus isn't talking about a philosopher with the right to reign. He's talking about the kingdom of God, the reign of God. And that seems to me to be a lot closer to the Jewish conception, which Burton Mack said, no, it's not a Jewish conception. That's a later Jewish conception. Actually, that's not true. It is documented in Jewish sources in this period. And if you don't want to accept any of those, like the Dead Sea Scrolls or whatever, how about the book of Daniel? Daniel chapter 2 even speaks of the mystery of the kingdom, just like Jesus did, and so on. And then you've got the Kaddish. Presumably, Jewish prayers didn't derive this from Jesus. There's an ancient Jewish prayer that says, exalted and hallowed be your great and glorious name. May your kingdom come speedily and soon in our days and in the days of our children. Doesn't that sound at least a little bit like what we call the Lord's Prayer, which is in both Matthew and Luke, probably based on a shared source? That's another story. So Marcus Borg, he actually was part of the Jesus Seminar. He actually shared some of these views, but Borg actually is moving more towards a Jewish Jesus. He speaks of a renewal movement. He speaks of the nucleus of the 12, just like E.P. Sanders did. Um, and I'm not doing all these in chronological order because I'm going to come to the mainstream of the third quest later. But Borg is like closer to third quest than some of the others. So you have a miracle working holy man like Geza Vermish talks about, and talking about justice like Richard Horsley talks about. Warning of Israel's present course. Borg didn't see like a new era dawning in all the respects that, like, he wouldn't have agreed with Schweitzer or Sanders and all this, but he did speak of Israel was on a collision course with Rome and so on. Conflicts with the Pharisees over Torah interpretation. So Borg really emphasizes Jesus saying about mercy over sacrifice, which is Matthew 9:13 and 12:7, specifically Matthean, just like Schweitzer was really big on Matthew 10:23, which is specifically Matthean. But anyway, future threat, but not apocalyptic calculations. I agree with some of this. The system was collapsing with a concomitant challenge to the current elite and worldly security. But I also think Jesus was not just speaking of what happened in 70, but he was looking for something a bit more cosmic than that. But again, that's debated. N.T. Wright wouldn't completely agree with me, although he wouldn't completely agree with Borg, I think, either, because nobody writes a whole book on the resurrection and speaks of the coming resurrection or bodily existence in the future and doesn't believe something more than that. But anyway, future kingdom, you've got it a number of times. You have it in all the early sources about Jesus. And you have Jesus talking about the 12 reigning on 12 thrones, which seems to imply, Jesus is king over them and they are reigning over Israel. That's kind of a new setup there. And when Paul echoes Jesus' end time teachings already in First Thessalonians, and I would add Second Thessalonians, although not everybody would agree with me that that's as early. But anyway, I'm so tempted to digress everywhere, but this is not a 40-hour course, so I'm going to go on. But the earliest parts of the New Testament already portray that way. So the third quest, the center of the third quest was looking at Jesus in his Jewish context. So the Jesus seminar had a lot of people in it, no more than 100 at any given time, but this is 100 out of thousands of New Testament scholars. And most of them, I've mentioned like Crossan and Borg, but apart from them, most of them were not writing major works on the historical Jesus. So the third quest, the center of it was coming back to the Jewish Jesus, valued earlier by Weiss and Schweitzer. But now we have more than the apocalyptic elements of what we call the pseudepigrapha to work with. We've got the Dead Sea Scrolls, Josephus, the Jewish wisdom tradition, some of it later developed into the rabbinic tradition, and so forth. Geza Vermish was actually one of the earliest voices on this. There'd actually been a Jewish reclamation of Jesus going back long before this, from both German and British and other scholars, Jewish scholars, who were saying, no, okay, we may not believe Jesus is the Messiah, we may not believe Jesus rose from the dead, but hey, Jesus was ours before you Gentiles got him. So Klausner and others, but Geza Vermish made it more mainstream. He was a Hungarian Jewish scholar, very gentle man, who taught at Oxford alongside E.P. Sanders. So they didn't see quite eye to eye on every point, but they respected each other and learned from each other. Anyway, Vermish ended up writing a trilogy and then some other books about the Jewishness of Jesus, beginning in 1973, emphasizing Jesus' Jewishness. He recognizes that Jesus probably did expect an imminent kingdom, but his focus is on charismatic sages. What I mean by that is people who did wonders, what people considered miracles. And such sages had conflicts with the Pharisees, who were more um, Bible centric or Torah centric. Um, so they didn't always get along with the Pharisees. And he says, that fits Jesus. And the main examples he gives actually are examples of them working miracles, actually may come from centuries after they lived, in contrast to what we have with Jesus. Nevertheless, they do show that Jewish people were interested in this kind of thing. So Honi, the circle drawer, Josephus calls him Onias. He was actually before the time of Jesus' ministry. Hanina ben Dosa, who was from Galilee. Probably he was in the 1st century, although that's debated, but he was also known for working miracles in later sources. Especially they were known for getting it to rain, which is not mainly what Jesus was doing, but in later sources, they also came to be associated with other things, other kinds of miracle works. There aren't a whole lot of early reports about them regarding healing, and the rabbinic reports about Honi come from half a millennium later. And more relevant are some Old Testament examples. So Isaiah, for example, with the healing of Hezekiah, Abraham has to pray for Pharaoh and his household, but especially signs and wonders. Well, especially they were most common with Moses. That also needs to be taken into account, and many have taken that into account with the Gospels. But Gezer particularly also mentioned Elijah. And so when people picked on him, said, the stuff about Honi and Kanina is later, he said, but I also mentioned Elijah and Elisha, and he's right. So one up for Gezer on that. But in terms of Elijah, it's not just that he worked signs, but also in Malachi and in Sirach, an early Jewish wisdom work, Elijah is portrayed as coming back as an end time prophet. And also you may have something like that in 4th Ezra and 1st Enoch. So the idea of both a signs prophet who works signs and an end time prophet, that can fit Elijah. And so some of the things in the Gospels look a lot like Elijah. Not saying that Jesus was the end time Elijah. Jesus, from what we have in the Gospels, he points to John the Baptist as preparing the way for him as the end time. Anyway, I won't go into that because, well, I'll just deal with it in my commentaries. That's another subject again. So E.P. Sanders was actually a Gentile scholar who, coming alongside Vermish and other Jewish scholars, forcefully advanced the idea of Jesus' Jewish context. Now, Sanders was a student of W.D. Davies, and I was a student of E.P. Sanders. So W.D. Davies emphasized the Jewish context of early Christianity, most famous for his work on Paul, but wasn't just limited to Paul. But Sanders had developed Davies' work on the Jewish context of Paul. Later, he turns to the Jewish context of Jesus and others, even though I'm focusing on Sanders here, and he's probably the best known, which I recognized before I was his student, but also James Charlesworth at Princeton and others have very much emphasized the Jewishness of Jesus. Now, Sanders saw Jesus as an end-time prophet, and instead of comparing him so much with Honi or Morton Smith's view, usually considered eccentric, that Jesus was a magician, Horsley has critiqued that, and a bunch of others have critiqued that, although Crossan follows it. But anyway, getting back to the main approach of Sanders. Sanders thinks of Theudas, Judas the Galilean, and the Egyptian prophet spoken of by Josephus, first century Jewish historian. And Theudas and, well, Judas the Galilean was earlier, but Theudas and the Egyptian prophet come from later than Jesus' ministry, but they are often compared. And actually, Rebecca Gray, who was Sanders' wife, also a very gracious person. Well, I found Sanders very gracious too. See, once I say it, where do I stop? I found a lot of them very gracious. But anyway, Richard Horsley is very gracious. But anyway, sticking with Sanders, you can tell I'm ADHD, can't you? Sticking with Sanders, he saw Jesus as being like these people who promised an end time sign. And the sign that one of them promised was he would make the walls of Jerusalem fall down. He didn't succeed, but he did make that promise. Another, his sign, and actually the idea of calling them sign prophets goes back to Paul Barnett. But oh, there's so much I could say. Anyway, but the idea of yeah, and there's a bunch of other people have done worked on these kind of prophets. Webb also did on prophets like John the Baptist and so on. But these sign prophets, one of the other ones said he would make the Jordan part. So what they seem to be doing is trying to act like Moses or like Joshua, his successor. Deuteronomy 18 promised a future prophet like Moses. So you've got Elijah, you've got Moses, and that background plays into the Gospels as well. Jesus, when he feeds the 5,000, and again, not getting into the questions about surrounding that or the feeding the 4,000 and so on, but the Gospels certainly portray Jesus as doing a Moses-like thing and an Elisha-like thing, and so on. So Sanders, in his historical approach to Jesus, he doesn't start with the sayings like Jeremias or Manson or Matthew Black with Aramaic sayings and so on. He starts with what he thinks are the most secure historical points, easy to document, and things that recur a lot and are multiply attested in the Gospels. And so one of the things he starts with, for example, is Jesus' action in the temple, overturning the tables in the temple. And he compares that to the early Jewish expectation of a new temple. He speaks of the continuity between John the Baptist and Jesus' movement. Well, if you connect the dots between John the Baptist and Jesus' movement, oh, they've both got baptism, or they both talk about the imminent future and so on. If you connect the dots, what's between them? About Jesus. So he reconstructs the historical Jesus based on the points he thinks are most certain, and then works out from there. Sees Jesus as a prophet of restoration eschatology, future restoration of Israel, like some other of his contemporaries. He's got 12 disciples. The Dead Sea Scrolls have a group of 12 of leaders because they thought of themselves as restoring God's plan for Israel. So this is now widely accepted, Bart Ehrman and a lot of others. So pretty much, well, not totally across the board, but many people see Jesus as a prophet of restoration eschatology. Now, again, many of us see Jesus as more than what many of these scholars talk about, but that doesn't mean we can't learn from what they do talk about that actually does fit the Gospels. So Sanders believes Jesus normally kept the law, but occasionally the law could be set aside for the emergency of the kingdom, and thinks that Jesus may have done that. That also has a context in early Judaism. Now, Sanders saw the kingdom as only future. And part of that, I think, is because he divided the kingdom material in the Gospels into 6 categories, but he allowed things to be used only once. So if you've already used up all the present stuff about the kingdom in another category, you don't have anything left for a new category called presence of the kingdom. So I think it's a forced choice on that. Students don't always agree with their teachers on everything, although I loved my teachers, including E.P. Sanders, and he was very, very kind to me. But anyway, uh, the kingdom is received as a gift. It's entered as a child. Well, those talk about something that was already available in his day. And again, the mustard seed principle. He doubts Jesus as a prophet of national repentance. And this is something where he's been critiqued as well, because there were other restoration prophets, not least John the Baptist, who apparently did seek to bring their people to repentance. Jesus, in material shared by Matthew and Luke, talks about towns that haven't adequately repented, and elsewhere speaks of Israel as a whole not repenting enough. In his later work, Sanders does acknowledge Jesus talks about repentance. He just doesn't see it as a major theme. He's more optimistic in his later work about what we can say about Jesus historically than in his earlier work. But again, in the earlier work, he was trying to establish a shared groundwork. My favorite may be his work, Jewish Law from Jesus to the Mishnah, but that may be partly because I have a signed copy from him, and I also checked some of his sources at his he asked me to check them for him. Mainstream historical Jesus scholarship today includes works like the 4-volume Handbook of the Historical Jesus, published by Brill. It's rather expensive, but you can find it in the library if you can't afford it, which you probably can't, but if you can get it, it's very, very thorough. First 2 volumes especially valuable. Other mainstream historical Jesus scholarship, I've mentioned E.P. Sanders. John Meyer may be the most meticulous. He and Raymond Brown, very detailed. Geza Vermish, obviously, Gert Tyson and others. Here's a picture of the book by Gert Tyson and Annette Mertz that I use actually as a textbook, for one of the textbooks for my PhD students studying historical Jesus. Again, this is not to talk about agreeing with everything everybody says, but to know what is being said among critical Jesus scholars, and again, a range of them. Tyson and Mertz are pretty close to, they're pretty close to centrist, mainstream. Same with John Meyer. The memory approaches to Jesus. Now, the memory approach has gone a lot further today, but some of the early studies in this that broke ground, James Dunn, building to some degree, building on the work of Kenneth Bailey, which some people have criticized, but Bailey actually grew up. He spent some of his childhood in Egypt. He spent decades, so much of his life in the Middle East. He knew it. It was his own culture, in a sense. So, and others can build on that. But Dunn did a lot of great work on this in terms of memory of Jesus, in terms of social memory. Dale Allison has also worked on memory in terms of social memory. He's also done other historical Jesus work, but social memory, just recently retired from Princeton. And also some on psychological memory, talking about the weaknesses of our memory, but also, the gist is likely to be remembered. So not verbatim memory, but gist memory. Psychological memory is developed especially by Richard Bauckham in his work, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. We know from Paul's letters that some of the eyewitnesses were still around, leading the mother church a couple decades after Jesus' public ministry. And again, Bauckham has been criticized. Some people said he went too far, but it's not like the eyewitnesses were raptured to heaven suddenly when Jesus was exalted. Again, I'm speaking from a Christian perspective about Jesus' exaltation, but who would think that the eyewitnesses stopped being heeded? Samuel Bierskog has pointed out, a great Swedish scholar, has pointed out that when people were writing history, and this would apply to biography as well, you'd try to hear what the witnesses had to say. And he thinks Bauckham took it further than he would, but Bauckham gives us important insights about how much the actual witnesses could have remembered. You know, in terms of memory studies, a lot of memory studies deal with social memory, um, and what we often call um, historical tradition. But before you have historical tradition, in terms of um, those who work on social memory, oral historians talk about before you get to oral tradition, you have oral history. So for 60 to 80 years or so, eyewitnesses or those who knew the eyewitnesses are alive, and where we can check that material actually fits other historical evidence really well. All the first century gospels are by definition within that period. So psychological memory, the memory of the eyewitnesses, is really something to be taken into account. It is valuable. We also need to take into account the genre of our main sources, which has not always been done in historical Jesus studies. So Richard Burridge broke ground with that, and actually there were people before him, Charles Talbert especially, David Owney, and others, uh, actually reviving a trend that started with Clyde Votah in the early 20th century, but was kind of quenched with the rise of form criticism. And I don't mean to throw all of form criticism under the bus, but when people said, we don't really care about the form of the Gospels, we care about the forms of the oral traditions that went into the Gospels. And that had to be reevaluated in terms of newer approaches to social memory and so on than the form critics had available in their day when they were using Russian and German folk tales that have been passed on for centuries instead of, what we know from more concrete studies of oral memory today. But anyway, also Helen Bond and others have also dealt with ancient biography in the Gospels in terms of how that relates to them as historical sources for what we can know about Jesus. I worked on that in my book, Christobiography. I also dealt with memory in there. Bart Ehrman has also dealt with it. My approach was different from Bart's, but again, we all differ from one another. I know Bart was not happy with Richard Bauckham's work, but he does agree with Richard Burridge's work, and I've tried to build on Richard Burridge's work as well as Richard Bauckham's work. So even more optimistic than the centrists. So I would consider myself fairly mainstream, but I'm not in the center of where historical Jesus scholarship is. As I mentioned, that would be Sanders, Meyer, Brown, and others. I lean toward, well, I accept more as not just historically plausible, but that we have evidence for more being authentic in the historical Jesus tradition personally. Well, personally, based on what I do find evidence for, I accept the rest. So yeah, I guess I am pretty conservative on that. Although I think I'm closer to the center than some of the people on the far left. But there are people way to the right of me as well. So anyway, just to say, some of us in kind of my ballpark are the Craigs. Craig Keener, that's me, Craig Evans, Craig Blomberg, and there are also some other Craigs, but I don't want to say they all agree with us on every point. We actually don't all agree with each other on every point, but we agree quite a lot on the Gospels. Samples of views today. So there's overlap, but in general, Marcus Borg sees Jesus more as a mystic, like a shaman. So he wouldn't believe in actual things like walking on water or real raisings from the dead, but he does make comparisons, believes that people experienced healing and exorcism and so on. And actually, even Strauss, not Mark Strauss, he's in the same ballpark as Craig Evans and Craig Blomberg and Darrell Bach and myself and so on. Uh, but Strauss, I mentioned earlier, David Friedrich Strauss, who was very skeptical, thought a lot of miracle stuff in the Gospels was myth. He believed that Jesus dealt with spirits or what people believed to be spirits. He actually was going around the countryside to things like seances and stuff in his day. So, yeah, there have been a number of interesting inputs into the line of historical Jesus scholarship. But anyway, Marcus Borg speaks of a mystic shaman kind of Jesus, but also Jesus battles injustice. And he's a sage, he's a prophet, he's a founder of a renewal movement. So he can account for a number of elements in the Jesus tradition: prophet, sage, miracle worker, and so on, although not all of it. Geza Vermish sees Jesus as a charismatic healer, teacher, and prophet. E.P. Sanders sees Jesus as kind of an end time prophet. Richard Horsley sees him as a political prophet. There are diverse methods in this study. So synthesizing the big picture, N.T. Wright is superb at seeing Jesus in the context of not just early Judaism generally, not just the Greco-Roman world, even more generally, but particularly in light of motifs in Old Testament prophets, especially Isaiah's, well, it wasn't just Isaiah, but the new Exodus motif and the restoration of God's people. So developing some stuff that's in Sanders. Sanders and Dunn and Wright had a lot in common, although I'm not sure how much they all, well, Wright and Dunn knew that they had a lot in common with Sanders anyway. So in terms of meticulous detail, so kind of on the opposite end of Wright on the spectrum, Raymond Brown and John Meyer, two very centrist Catholic scholars, great, excellent, detailed work. Again, I'm not saying I agree with every point, but you can't ignore their work. All of us have presuppositions, all of us have assumptions, but yeah, just when you get everything out on the table, that's when you can do scholarship by examining the different things and responding to the different things. Sanders worked especially from undisputed assumptions about Jesus, or rarely disputed assumptions about Jesus' deeds. Mining Jesus' words again, Jeremias and Manson did a lot of that. I'd like to see some more scholars working on that today. Actually, Dale Allison has done some of that with recurrent attestation. And again, there's so many different scholars working on so much of this that I'm just not mentioning everybody. My colleague at Asbury, there are many New Testament theological themes developed in Jesus's teachings, including Jesus' teachings about himself. And those got developed a lot by elsewhere in the New Testament on the foundations already there in Jesus' teachings. And Ben Witherington has dealt with that. One of his early works, actually, I was thinking of writing a book on this. Then Ben's book came out, and I said, "What?" This was before we were colleagues. And I said, "Wow, that's great. He just saved me a year of work." So his Jesus Quest book also offers a useful survey of streams of Jesus scholarship. And yeah, N.T. Wright synthesizes Jesus material in light of some Old Testament motifs, as I mentioned. Massive works, a whole series of works that he does. Now, what's the future of the Jesus Quest? Some now are speaking of a fourth quest. Problem is, nobody agrees on what that is, and nobody agrees. Well, not nobody, but a lot of people think we're still in the third quest. So, in terms of the fourth quest, one I think useful direction, and this has been brought in by some other scholars. I mean, Sanders and others have paid attention to John, but Paul Anderson really thinks we need to incorporate more of the fourth gospel, what we call the fourth gospel, John, into a quest for the historical Jesus, and that will help shape things. And there are a number of us who think that's a good idea. Also, the future, and perhaps we might end up calling this the fourth quest, or maybe the fifth quest, but it's certainly ripe for this. Many more voices from the majority world, and hopefully they'll feel free to speak out of their own cultural and faith convictions and not be bound to the concerns that have dominated Western Enlightenment interests. And hopefully in all this, we can get to know more about Jesus himself, because there's certain things with our Western Enlightenment interests that get screened out of the discussion. And from one generation to the next, some things are a pendulum, eschatological Jesus or non-eschatological Jesus. And Jesus is the Messiah. No, Jesus didn't think he was the Messiah. Jesus foreknew his death. No, he didn't think that he was going to die. It'll be great to get past some pendulums, I think, and to be able to incorporate a wider array of the material that we have in our main sources for Jesus historically, which are the Gospels. Again, in the historical context that we know about Jesus, his Galilean context, his Jewish context, and so forth. And there's so much more that could be said, but I wanted to keep this within temporal bounds. And again, this is trying to survey a range of views, not just my own view, but I did insert myself in my opinions more than I intended. So anyway, just like most historical Jesus books do, I just gave some of my own. Thanks for being with me.